Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Tom Hanks is back as Robert Langdon with Ron Howard for another Dan Brown adaptation, Inferno. Robert Langdon, played by Tom Hanks, wakes up in a hospital in Florence with no idea of how he got there thanks to amnesia from a severe head trauma, and his doctor, Sienna Brooks, played by Felicity Jones, soon helps him escape an assassin. Langdon finds in his clothes a biohazard tube with a bone projector inside with Botticelli's map of hell on it, the first clue in a Dante-themed maze laid forth by billionaire Bertram Zobrist, played by Ben Foster, who had extreme views on overpopulation and committed suicide recently. At the end of the hunt lies the virus Inferno that will kill half the world's populace and soon be released. Now Langdon and Sienna must race to find and stop it while keeping ahead of those after them, but is his damaged mind, plagued by horrific visions, up to the task? It's been 10 years since director Ron Howard and star Tom Hanks first teamed up for an adaptation of Dan Brown's hugely successful Robert Langdon books for the Da Vinci Code, which was the second in that series, but by far the most popular and successful, so obviously it was the one that was converted to the screen first. And before that movie came out, I remembered it was marred with huge amounts of secrecy and controversy, both from church groups that were obviously against the religious message in that film, but also from art historians that took liberty with the inaccuracies of the actual history that was portrayed in the film. And then everyone saw it and realised it was a pile of rubbish and promptly stopped caring. The Da Vinci Code movie, which I rewatched for this review, and believe me, my opinion on it has not changed one iota since I first saw it when it came out, is that it's an insanely boring movie. It is one of the most boring mainstream blockbusters I can think of in recent memory. It is equivalent to having Tom Hanks as your museum tour guide, leading you around darkened rooms, and then occasionally you'll have to run for about 30 seconds as someone tries to kill you. Rinse and repeat. There are no characters in it, it's just relentless, dry, tedious exposition. Howard and Hanks re-teamed a couple of years later for Angels and Demons in 2009, the second film, but actually the first book in the series. They retrofitted it as a sequel to the Da Vinci Code for the film version. That was a bit of an improvement. Don't get me wrong, it's basically the same movie except that they were now running around a lot. But at least it gave you a sense of thriller and excitement, even though it is completely ridiculous. The last half hour of that film is almost an absurdist comedy. I kind of wish that the whole film was as insane as the final 30 minutes of that movie. Look, there's Ewan McGregor as a flying Cavalango! And we all thought that Hanks and Howard were done with it. But oh no, they're back with their third Langdon film, Inferno, managing to skip over the third Langdon book, The Lost Symbol, which is generally regarded by fans of the series as being incredibly dull, which, by the standards of this series, is really saying a lot. As you can probably work out, I'm not a huge fan of the Langdon films. In fact, I would go as far as to say that they're probably some of the worst things that Ron Howard has ever directed in his long career. That being said, when Inferno opened, I was genuinely quite open and curious about how this one would fare, because this one actually got me engaged right from the outset. And it's got a good hook to it. Langdon wakes up in his hospital bed, his head has been grazed by a bullet, so he has amnesia, he's completely disorientated, and he has to piece all this together, and then someone's trying to kill him. We're just smashed right into the middle of the action. And Howard really goes full pelt at trying to make you feel the symptoms that Langdon is feeling with these really close, almost borderline extreme close-ups on Hanks and other people's faces. There are flash frames and visions that Langdon is seeing. This is the first Langdon movie that goes into plain straight horror imagery. These visions that Langdon is seeing, they really are quite disturbing for a PG-13 movie. They really push it to the limit. These quickly become established as him delusioning Dante's vision of hell. It's genuinely intense and terrifying. It's like he said to himself, okay, people thought the previous Langdon films were boring, well, I'm gonna change that this time, and he just goes all out. There is not a moment in this movie that is not in some way breathlessly delivered, either people talking as fast as they can or people running. The first thing that we see in the movie is Ben Foster's Bertram Zobrist being chased by someone, and that pretty much sets the tone for the entire rest of the movie. And this movie really did have my curiosity for a while. I genuinely wondered what the answers to this setup were. But as the film continues, with its relentless pace, you realise that Howard's direction is a cover, because once you get underneath that, there is nothing to this movie whatsoever. It just completely disintegrates. It is totally preposterous, just empty thrills. Tom Hanks is one of the great actors of our generation, but he's utterly squandered playing someone like Langdon, who is this stuffy academic type. He's such a boring character. I mean, bless Tom Hanks. He spent 3 movies playing this guy. He's desperately trying to inject some amount of humanity into him, and at times you can kind of see it in this movie. But he could be doing so much more than this. It's a movie that really that feels like it's just relying on how much you like Tom Hanks so much of the time. And all he has to do in this movie is run around to places and spout exposition. Occasionally, this movie will mix it up because he'll look around confused most of the time. He spends most of this movie going, I don't know what that is. I can't remember what that is. And Hanks is hugely overqualified for this. But speaking of massively overqualified, Academy Award nominee Felicity Jones gets to play, essentially, Langdon's right-hand woman. I realised when I was watching this movie that the Langdon books and their appeal, they're basically like the James Bond movies. These movies are like James Bond if they were helmed by a really dull person at the centre of it. So instead of having a Bond girl, we now have a Langdon girl who always has to be a brunette. And, you know, of course we had Audrey Tautou in the Da Vinci Code, and there was that one in Angels and Demons that had so little bearing on the story that I can't remember the actress's name at this precise moment. And it's probably a credit to Felicity Jones that she doesn't disappear completely into the background of this movie, having to run alongside Tom Hanks in ill-fitting shoes, because of course she has to. And at least she's able to give as good as it gets to Langdon. She's able to contribute and help out Langdon. And it feels like our character is much more central and involved than either of the previous 2 lead actresses from the Langdon movies. But still, what a waste of Felicity Jones in this movie. And once you realise these are basically James Bond movies, you can't stop making a comparison. But the thing is, these movies would almost be fun if they didn't take themselves nearly so seriously. And Ron Howard is so faithful in keeping that sense of self-importance from the books in the films, and it really makes them quite tiresome to sit through. And it doesn't help that they've tried to adapt this doorstopper of a book into 2 hours. The guy who adapted it, David Coep, who, among other things, wrote Spider-Man and Panic Room, he's been upgraded to full writing credit here after sharing it on Angels and Demons with Akiva Goldsman, who adapted the Da Vinci Code. The script for this adaptation becomes totally convoluted because there's so many people after Langdon and their different agendas that the plot pulls in so many different threads and directions. So among the parties that we have going after Langdon is the World Health Organization, led by Zidzi Babette Knudsen of Borgen fame, and Omar Sy. And the representation of them in this movie is hilarious. It is like they're being treated as if they were the CIA. They will fly in by helicopter into somewhere and just start running the show, telling police officers, shut this down, shut it all down, we need to find Langdon, we need to find him now, we need to shut down this operation, we need to contain the area. It's a ridiculous portrayal of them on screen. Omar Sy is essentially playing a covert agent, because that's how the WHO operates. But as it turns out, they're not the most ridiculous thing in this movie. Oh no! Because the other people that are involved with Langdon are this private security company known as CRC, but what they basically are is the supervillain hotline. They are Spectre. They are running what is essentially a direct line to dictators and various movie villains, it seems like, hidden inside this cargo freighter. And they're led by Indian superstar Irfan Khan, who is by far the best thing about this movie. Playing this guy who is essentially the puppeteer. He is the guy that you hire to rearrange things if you don't want to get caught by the authorities. Every time that Khan is on screen, he is brilliant. He knows exactly what he's in and how he needs to play it, and it's a real breath of fresh air. It also helps that he probably gets some of the best lines in the movie, because he is basically playing a supervillain if he suddenly grew a conscience. So we have all these different characters after Langdon, these two groups by themselves, but also you've got various members in those groups whose allegiances change within the story. And elsewhere, this third party that connects all of them, Bertrand Zobrist. Ben Foster is not in this movie for very long. He literally dives out of it at the very beginning of the movie and is only seen in flashbacks for about 10 minutes afterward. This whole thing that is his dying wish, essentially. He should be an overarching presence throughout the entire movie, but there are long stretches where you forget that he was the one that instigated this entire hunt in the first place. Unlike the previous Langdon movies, this deals with a very real issue, the issue of human overpopulation, that we are going to either destroy the planet, destroy our resources, and eventually destroy ourselves. And Zobrist has these really extreme views that humanity has to be in some way culled for its own good. And the thing with this adaptation is that I feel that Ron Howard, for all this darkness that he starts off the movie with, he chickens out here. He really does, because I think Howard I don't think he agrees with Brown's opinion of overpopulation. I don't think he agrees to some extent with Zobrist as a character, so he really limits him. It never feels like the movie really wants to properly interact with this in case it actually ends up aligning itself with its own villain. This character, he's basically a supervillain in a Bond movie. He has this evil scheme. He is set for Langdon, this hugely elaborate map, dependent on him arriving in places at just the right moment, depending on him knowing exactly what this Dante reference is referring to. And it's just preposterous. They're just running from one place after the other, and you just think to yourself, well, if you wanted to do this, I'm pretty sure you could have done this much more directly. And I like Ron Howard. Normally he's a really safe pair of hands on a movie, and I've loved some movies that he's done recently. I really like Rush, for example, but this movie's a mess. In terms of direction and structure, it's really unusually kind of all over the place for him, because in terms of coherency, it is completely shot by the air sync. Characters will be talking to each other, but things are so fast you won't have time to register them. It just goes from one ear out the other. They might as well be speaking at Aaron Sorkin speeds. I think Howard has in some way realised that his movie is incoherent in places, because every so often when Langdon remembers a clue, we have to flash back through the movie every time that clue was mentioned. Ron, I can follow the plot of the story just about. You don't need to keep giving the audience a bone. We can follow what's going on, and it doesn't help that there are bits of the plot that even on a cursory glance of the movie you find yourself going, hang on a minute, how does that fit with that? For example, there's a key plot point in this movie that Langdon has committed a robbery in the 48 hours that he can't remember, and he doesn't understand how this all came about. The circumstances of what reason he did that are a little bit clearer at the end of the movie, but I was still wondering at what point in the timeline did that actually occur? When did that happen within the movie? What happened to the other guy who, I guess he's dead because he doesn't seem to feature in the rest of the movie? It just... what? How does this figure into the plot of everything else? And the answer is, it doesn't. It's a distraction, really, from what's actually going on in the movie. It's like the setup itself, in that it initially captures your interest, and then you realise that it's really secondary to what's actually going on, and you feel like you've been had. I don't know how to place Inferno in terms of the Robert Langdon movies. I certainly liked it more than I did the Da Vinci Code, but I don't think it's a better movie than Angels and Demons, and I think there are probably going to be people that really hate this movie, especially if you like the puzzle box aspect of the previous Langdon movies. There's far less of that here, because it just gets lost in the shuffle like everything else. You just wish that Tom Hanks and Ron Howard would get together and do something that isn't Robert Langdon movies. Inferno manages to have far more forward momentum and immediacy than either of the previous Langdon films, but that doesn't make it good. Director Ron Howard hits the accelerator and hopes you don't notice that everything that's happening on screen is nonsense, filling it with constant edits and flashbacks. As usual, Dan Brown's very silly plots are taken very seriously, playing here like a Bond film without the irony. It's again a waste of a lot of very talented actors, including Tom Hanks, whose natural integrity and charisma still can't make Langdon interesting, as he runs around with the equally overqualified Felicity Jones, while only Irfan Khan seems to be having fun out of the huge international cast. The plot, with so many twists and parties after Langdon, quickly gets marred in its own convolution, with explanation and coherence left in the dust by the frantic pace in a way that will leave both newcomers and Brown fans feeling empty. Coming up soon, Alexander Skarsgård and Michael Pena open fire in War on Everyone, Justin Timberlake and Anna Kendrick find the music of Trolls, and Benedict Cumberbatch expands his reality as Doctor Strange. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
Humanity is the disease. Inferno is the cure.